Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you're doing well. Good morning to those of you obviously on the West Coast. I'm in New York, so it's noon here, but I'm so happy to see you. I'm really glad that you're with us this morning. It's been such an eventful week. The last time we talked on Thursday, there was still sort of some uncertainty about the election and the outcome. A lot has been, a lot has happened since then, and there are some questions about legal cases and about challenges in the courts, but it appears as though the election has sort of been decided. And obviously, this is a really important moment. We haven't had an election in this country this important in many, many generations, even. And I think that a good place to start today is to just chat for like a few minutes and talk about the thoughts we have or our opinion or what we think about the outcome. And I'd like to hear from as many of you as possible because this is an opportunity for us to just kind of clear the air or share what we think about what happened. And so, what do you all think? What thoughts do you have about the election before we get started today? Go ahead, Manuel.
Hi, I just wanted to say that regardless of Trump's policies, he, in a way, he's kind of a genius. The way he manipulated the media in his favor and manipulated the minds of the Americans to believe outlandish claims and the way he was able to advertise his own campaign through his own Twitter account and just his whole persona is what led to him almost winning again and taking the election in 2016 almost handedly. And I think it's going to set a precedent for future candidates, especially for outsiders too, at the same time.
Yeah, so he's a marketing genius. We don't have to mince words. That's what he's best at. And he makes his money in business primarily just putting his name on things, not necessarily through, shrewd calculation like an ordinary businessman might. And although there are questions about how much money he actually has, we can't dispute that he's effective at communicating and speaking to, in particular, constituencies who haven't often been reached by, run-of-the-mill politicians. And so that's all been very consequential. On the other hand, I think it can also be said that he set the stage for someone to come in the future and maybe be more effective politically while still using some of those marketing techniques that we talked about. Some people have said that the next authoritarian will be much more competent and they might be equally skilled when it comes to speaking to some of those constituencies who ordinarily haven't been involved in politics. He's a populist. He really is. The Republican Party is his party, but he's a populist who primarily gets his support from disaffected voters who find his way of communicating appealing. And, what that means for the future and going forward, that's a good question. He appears to be on his way out now, but I don't think we've seen the last of him in terms of the influence he can have over the Republican Party, his base. What his supporters will do is also a question. We know that democracy often depends on the players accepting the rules, agreeing on the rules, and coordinating around the rules. And the Constitution itself is just a piece of paper. If the actors don't accept the outcomes, don't legitimate the outcomes, that can discredit the institutions. And so this way of communicating is very effective. And what he communicates, even on his way out, could really, really be consequential. So I agree. And there's just a lot to say there. Let's hear from some more of you all. What do you all think? Do you have thoughts about the election? How do you feel about it? I'll go ahead and read some of these comments, but I'd like, if you want to make a comment and use the mic, just chime in. I'll give you the floor. There's not really a great way of doing this. You can raise your hand if you want, or you can just begin talking and I'll give you the floor.
This election, I know it shouldn't, but it's getting funny to watch because in 2016 we saw with the Democrats, they were claiming that it was rigged, that there was no way Trump would have won. They were finding voter fraud. They were trying to find voter fraud and demanding recount after recount after recount. And we're seeing it happen again, only this time it's the Republicans, and they're all kind of acting like children, claiming that they found hundreds of thousands of mail-in votes and this shouldn't have happened and yada, yada, yada. And it's just getting funny to watch.
Yeah, to that I have two comments. I actually don't remember Democrats claiming voter fraud that much. I remember them claiming interference on the part of Russia and how that might have influenced the outcome. I could be mistaken. But I think in the big picture, Stephen's point is really important, because I think what we're seeing here is that our democratic institutions are being discredited on both sides. There are serious questions about the validity of the result over and over and over again, stemming all the way from the 2000 election, which was handed to George Bush Jr. by the Supreme Court after a recount in Florida that later on was shown to be incorrect. Gore won that election. The big picture here is that democratic institutions appear to be kind of fraying, and the validity of the result is often in question. Even if the result is valid, truly, in the hearts and minds of people, there is more and more doubt about the validity, and that's really what matters. And so I think that really no one wins here, to be honest with you. Stephen highlights that both sides have serious questions and grievances. They're concerned about the result. And again, even if the result is valid, truly, the perceptions that people have are what really matter. And so it's interesting that Stephen would make this point, because today in class we'll begin talking about electoral systems, and we'll eventually get to an important question, which is, would changing the electoral system in the US to sort of more of a ranked choice system change the politics here? And I think that one consideration is, how does the electoral system bear on the views of the validity of the process that are held by people? Do people see the process as more or less valid depending upon the type of electoral system? Are they uninspired by the two-party system and the majoritarian institutions that we have that tend to favor that two-party system? How could we inspire people to view the result as more valid, more representative, more accurate, etc.? These are really deep questions. And I think at stake is American democracy. And so really there are no winners, because more and more doubt is being cast about the institutions and whether they're really working. And we're getting to the point where people are wondering if their vote really counts, even putting aside the Electoral College and the way in which the institutions disproportionately favor, red states. Let's hear from some more folks. Go ahead, Efren.
Yeah, regarding that was my a point that I was gonna make. So throughout the week and weekend, because of the election results, I kept hearing from both sides, which is something very interesting. The phrase "let the people decide," and that statement was very huge. And someone even like news anchors and analysts, even scholars, said how politicians from both sides said "let the people decide." It kind of showcased the desire for an electoral change, which is kind of uncommon with Republicans.
Efren, you got cut off. Are you still with us?
Oh, my bad.
No problem. I think it's just the, we're using the internet, so sometimes it stutters. Are you still there? Do you want to continue?
Yeah. I'll just finish very quickly. So like I said, a lot of people saying that now GOP candidates are looking into a possible electoral college reform, because they saw how this year it didn't favor them, but in 2016 they did. So they're possibly thinking of doing a kind of similar approach to gerrymandering to favor on their side. And so I think that was very interesting. And also with my second quick point is that I've never seen people very happy besides the 2008 election results. I've never seen so much happiness from people, and a lot of a desire of hope.
Yeah, so two comments I have. I actually hadn't heard about those discussions about potentially reforming the electoral system. That's really interesting. I really want to know more about that, because let's be honest, the Electoral College disproportionately favors the Republican Party because red states are overweighted in the system. But this election did not appear to favor them, and the advantages that they got from that system appear to be wearing down as some of those old red states become more blue. This is really interesting because we're seeing how the interests of the Republican Party are leading them to consider institutional reforms that we never thought were possible. And secondly, I share your enthusiasm about the positivity on the side of the Democrats and the way they view the outcome favorably. But I'm also thinking of it in a more nuanced way, because if we go back to 2016, like Stephen pointed out, the Democrats were very, very unsatisfied with the result. And they also were casting doubt on the counting of the votes and potential interference, et cetera. This year, the Republican Party is casting doubt on the electoral outcome. And so both sides, from election to election, appear to be trading places in how they view the system and whether they view it favorably. And whether the system is going to continue to be viewed favorably by the country at large, and whether it even is at all, is in question. And the polarization and the division, these are big challenges. And so I wonder if an electoral system reform could be in store, and when that might happen and what it would look like. Very interesting points. These are all things that connect directly to the class. In our discussion today, we'll deal with all of these issues. What do the rest of you all think? I'm going to go ahead and read some of these comments. Aylin says, I think I am very proud of young voters and the amount of people who went out to vote. The result also gave me a glimmer of hope, but I know that the fight is not over. Just because we voted him out does not mean that all of the issues in America are solved. We still have so much work to do and so much to fight for. Agreed. And you know, what's going to be challenging for the system as a whole is that it'll be a divided government unless the Georgia runoff results in 2 Democratic victories in the Senate. But that is going to be a tall hill to climb, and we'll have to wait and see. And I agree with you that a lot of work waits to be done. One discouraging thing is that with divided government, assuming the Georgia races don't favor the Democratic Party, it will be very difficult for Biden to govern at all. And I personally think, looking back, that Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, really made an error when she didn't agree to the stimulus that Trump and McConnell put forward before the election. She obviously made a political choice, calculating that that could benefit Trump and the Republicans in the election if she did that. There were some strings attached to that bill as well that she claimed were disqualifying. But that was a mistake, because we're not going to get an economic stimulus now because there's no incentive to do that. The next elections are way down the road, and the Republicans, in good faith, probably would never in good faith promote and agree to a stimulus. It was really a political ploy that would hopefully set them up to win in the election. And so Nancy Pelosi missed the boat on that one, and we're now very unlikely to get that kind of legislation because it would require the cooperation of the Senate. And so those Republicans are very unlikely to work with Biden. I don't mean to be so unoptimistic, but speaking realistically, this is the same Senate that also didn't give Merrick Garland even a hearing for more than a year when he was nominated by Obama as the next Supreme Court justice. And so the idea that they could get anything done with the same Senate is frankly, it's difficult to justify. Dorian says, I hope Biden actually sticks to the promises he made. Yeah, agreed, right? Regarding not just student debt crisis and ameliorating the crisis, but also reinserting the U.S. in the climate accord, the Paris Accord, reinstating the Iran nuclear deal, reestablishing cooperative relationships with allies and partners, softening on issues like regime change in Venezuela, tightening relationships with Latin American countries that wore down in the last 4 years. All of these issues matter to us greatly, you know, in addition to everything else, like healthcare and the possibility of a public option or even a single payer system, the preservation of DACA, in creating a path to citizenship for the undocumented. We could go on and on and on. How much of that can be accomplished given the composition of government and what we expect? That's sort of a question. And I return to that reality of divided government that's so difficult to deal with for any president. Anna Martha says the Trump campaign has produced no evidence of fraud yet, but it is not the first time that happened. Marissa Morales says, I'm happy with Biden winning the election, but I'm disappointed with how close the race was because I believe that Trump spreads more hate than Biden in policies and words and actions, and surprised with how many people were still on Trump's side. Although Biden won, I still think there's a lot to focus on still because of how divided the country is on issues like immigration, abortion, and other women's rights, DACA, etc. Agreed, Marissa. And you know what? I think that we can be optimistic, though, about what the Supreme Court will do. And the reason is because the Supreme Court cares a lot about their legitimacy. And the dynamic between the executive branch and the court will change when Biden takes office, because the Democratic president will sort of serve as some kind of a check in a way. Now, the Supreme Court can do whatever they want. And obviously the Republican Party has a huge majority on that court. But because they care about their legitimacy, I would be surprised if they overruled or struck down abortion rights, Obamacare, some of these other issues. Now, maybe they would do it before Biden takes power in January, but that would require a very quick turnaround, and it's unlikely that they could do that quickly, and they would be anticipating the change in power anyway. And so this does change the relationship between the executive and the judiciary for sure. Jake has his hand up. What's up, Jake?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to add, because you were talking about like a public option and all the like relief debt and that kind of thing, some more like progressive policies. And there's been like the narrative going around that a lot of Democrats in the House lost because of like they're blaming progressives and progressive policies. But I just wanted to point out that all of the progressives that ran on like Medicare for all and that type of thing, they all won, and even in like swing districts and red districts. So yeah, like I've just been seeing that narrative go around, but it's not true at all.
Yeah, and so what Jake is pointing out here, I think, is really important. And this is sort of like an untold part of the story, which is that there's a growing contingent of the Democratic Party that's very progressive. Sometimes they've been called the Justice Democrats. It's basically this sort of flank of, what is it now? Like more than a dozen legislators in the House who have adopted a single payer preference as far as Medicare healthcare is concerned. They're very, very progressive on issues like DACA and pathways to citizenship for the undocumented. And AOC and Ilhan Omar and others are the leaders of this flank. And they grew in size through this election. They picked up a number of new seats. And so the narrative is going to begin to change as this part of the party grows and as they pull the party a little bit to the left. Increasingly, it'll be harder and harder for traditional Democrats and a Democratic administration to ignore them, because the Democratic Party needs their votes. And so there will be some negotiating, some bargaining. How much influence they have in the party still is questionable because they're still relatively small. But as they get bigger and as younger generations age and get into politics, I expect that flank will get larger and larger. And this preference for like a single payer option will become more and more pronounced. And Jake points this out. You might not have heard about it because the media doesn't really report on it. They tend to discredit some of these figures. But the truth is that AOC and others have been among the most effective communicators, and they're holding Nancy Pelosi and others, their feet to the fire. And so I'm really excited about that personally. I won't hide, my preference. I think that they have the right agenda. And I think that if they can pull the Democratic Party from the center further to the left, that would be great. Efren says, I feel like what Nancy Pelosi did actually hurt the Senate. Oh, we've got two hands raised. Efren, what's up?
Oh, yeah, I just want to say with my comment because like I don't know, my computer's kind of glitching. So I actually I accidentally put Senate out. I was supposed to only put Democrat candidates because I don't know, like my computer right now is not able like to like it's not allowing me to type. So I just want to correct that error. And
Oh, yeah, no problem. No problem.
yeah, and also just a quick like very quick thing that I forgot to mention about that is that actually like AOC recently mentioned that like, well, actually it was taken out of context. So AOC said that like she doesn't know if she wants to be in politics anymore because like of like how many like seats like Democrats lost because of how it was like it mostly ran a traditional like Democrat instead of a progressive like agenda and allowing more like excitement and a lot of more representation from underserved communities to like engage in politics.
Yeah, I didn't see those comments, but I would be really discouraged if she left, to say the very least. I think that she's the future of the party and maybe the future of the country, and I hope that she is. And I support the squad, as they're called, entirely. And it's discouraging that there's this sort of cleavage and this division within the Democratic Party. It's discouraging that Pelosi and some of the traditional Democrats don't work harder to incorporate these more leftist, more progressive legislators. And I think that it's a mistake, moreover, because politically the Democratic Party is already relatively weak for reasons that we understand. And so to sort of weaken themselves further by driving these wedges between them and refusing to work and kind of draw on the ideas of the squad, I think is just it's a missed opportunity, and it's kicking yourself. Really, it's unnecessary. It's like finding the nearest bus and throwing yourself underneath it immediately. Jake, do you want to make a comment?
Oh, sorry. I think I still had my hand raised from earlier.
No problem. I'm enjoying the hand raise function. It helps a lot. Ian says, I didn't support Biden, but I'm accepting of the result and eager to see what he brings to the table, especially as far as strengthening ties with foreign nations. Ian, I'm right there with you. Let me be the first to say I'm not a Biden fan. I don't think that Biden was a good choice, to be honest with you. But I understand why he was chosen, and I understand why he won. What I hope we can get from Biden is a president who will represent everyone and will try to unify the country, will change some of our foreign policies and be less aggressive and take a less hostile stance with countries like Iran and Venezuela. I think that reinserting the United States in a variety of international organizations and treaties and agreements would be beneficial. And I think that generally speaking, we should take the country back to where we were before with regard to foreign relations. But I agree with you, Ian, that maybe for a variety of reasons, it's difficult to support Joe Biden. I don't know, for example, if he will really represent and fully promote the interests of younger people and younger generations. It's well known that he's in the back pocket of credit card companies, and those credit card companies benefit from making us pay more in fees and making it more difficult for us to generate savings. All of these things matter a great deal. And Biden is not Trump, and so he won the election. I think that's why he won the election. But what's discouraging for me is that for the second time in 4 years, the Democratic Party ran a candidate based on not being Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton was also promoted as not being Donald Trump, and it didn't work out well for Hillary Clinton. It worked out for Joe Biden, but maybe only because the country saw 4 years of Trump. I think that in the future, the Democratic Party, if it wants any chance of being relevant politically, needs to actually develop an agenda. It needs to represent groups that form its constituency, and it needs to speak for itself and not in the shadow of some other president or incumbent from the other party who they don't like. And so I don't love Biden. He wasn't my first choice. and he would never be my first choice. Nina says, we settled for Biden. There's a lot of agreement about this point. Rady says, I didn't like any of the candidates. I'll be honest, I liked Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders is not liked by the party because they can't control him, and because he is a stalwart, and they called him the Amendment King for a reason. I'll be honest, we all have a preference or a sort of bias, if you will. I thought that Bernie Sanders was a good candidate. I would have supported him, and I did. And we named our cat Bernie because we like Bernie. But I agree with Rady. On the whole, the candidates were not preferable. They just weren't. We're kind of stuck with these really undesirable choices. And this relates to a discussion we'll have in class today about US politics and whether the system is really working and whether we really see it representing us and our interests, whether we find ourselves settling for candidates that are undesirable, and really, what the future might hold for those of us who feel as if we're really being left behind. Aylin says, Bernie is the one that got away. Yeah, no kidding, right? Nina says, people were afraid of the actual change Bernie would have brought to his presidency. Agreed. He would have tipped over the apple cart, to say the very least. And what we mean is that he would have interrupted some of the streams of benefits and revenue and income that some of these establishment Democrats and other party members and establishment Republicans depend on so much. And the media too, by the way, the media too. Stephen says, politics has just become a set of screaming matches with people trying to outdo each other. To some degree, yes. Ian says, I hope that by the next election, people aren't at each other's throats over politics like this election. I agree, Ian. I agree. I think that we need to try to come together. The polarization is so extreme, and the distance between voters is so extreme that it's almost untenable. And it becomes difficult to govern effectively, and democratic institutions are discredited when the two sides can't cooperate, when there's so much division, and people lose faith in cooperative or consensus decision making. And it doesn't help that we have majoritarian institutions that award the winner all the seats. And it could possibly help if we transition to a system that was more proportional or would give voters more choices. I don't know. I feel like something has to change. Rady says, yes, especially the media. They should be unbiased. Efren says, in my opinion, I hope there's more presidential candidates from underrepresented communities to energize youth and marginalized individuals. Agreed, Efren. And we saw that there was significant turnout compared to previous elections among Latinos and among other communities that normally have voted in lower numbers. That's really exciting. And Indigenous people and Native Americans voted in larger numbers too. One interesting point is that John Lewis's district, the former congressman who passed away, the civil rights icon, his district, which is heavily Black, gave Georgia to Biden. That was the district that tilted that race in Biden's favor. And so that's an example of the power and the influence of minority communities. And needless to say, those groups are among the groups who have been left behind. And I think that it's been said before and should be said again, the Democratic Party relies too much on those communities and doesn't govern in their interest sufficiently, in my opinion. They should do far more. And that requires, I think, some of that energy and some of that youthfulness that we've talked about. Now, these are my opinions about the Democratic Party. I have opinions about the Republican Party too. I think they've gone too far right, and I think that they've been captured by an extreme form of populism. And this populism is ultimately rooted in grievances that are economic as well as racial and social and cultural and geographical as well. But the Republican Party has gone to the far right. And it's not true that the two parties have gone equally far in each direction. It's mainly a shift to the right on the part of the Republican Party that has resulted in this kind of division. The only movement to the left on the part of the Democratic Party is observable in the squad and in candidates like AOC and Ilhan Omar, who've been among the few who've promoted some of these reforms that are considered more aggressive. The bulk of the party supports the status quo, and there's nothing about that that's leftist. Okay, everybody, this is a really good primer for today's discussion in our next unit in the course. And that next unit is about elections and electoral systems. Now, you know what an electoral system is already, because when we discussed parties and party systems, we introduced the concept of an electoral system so that we can understand how social cleavages and electoral institutions interact to produce the number of parties in a country, the effective number of parties. That is the number of parties who are actually viable and compete are competitive in legislative elections. As we shift to focusing on electoral systems exclusively, we're going to be looking at a wider range of types of electoral systems. Previously, we mainly distinguished between a single member plurality district systems and in more proportional systems. Today, we're going to be talking about a wide range of different types of electoral systems that fall under majoritarianism, which is one sort of general category. And then on Thursday, we'll talk about types of systems that fall under proportional representation, which is a very different type of electoral system. But as we embark on this voyage that will include some discussion in a video later on today, let's define electoral system one more time. We refer to an electoral system as a set of laws that regulates electoral competition between candidates or parties or both. This is basically a concept that relates to how we vote and how we vote on election day, whether we vote for a single candidate or multiple candidates, whether we vote for a single party or multiple parties, and how many members are elected in a given district. Now, when we talk about electoral systems, we distinguish between electoral systems based on the formula that they employ. And really, we have three types of formulas. We have majoritarian formulas, which include single member district plurality systems that we already know about, alternative vote systems, two-round systems, supplementary vote systems, block vote systems, party block vote systems, single non-transferable vote systems, and then there's also a system called the board account. These are all majoritarian systems in that they give the winner the constituency, or they give the winners the constituency, as opposed to giving the constituencies seats to different parties or candidates based upon the proportion of the vote that they won. Now, the proportional set includes list proportional representation, single transferable vote. The mixed systems include dependent and independent electoral systems. Now, today we're going to focus mainly on majoritarian systems, and we'll focus on, in particular, ranked choice voting or alternative vote systems. And we'll think about whether switching to a ranked choice system would be beneficial here in the United States. Now, we begin this discussion by defining a majoritarian electoral system. This is one in which the candidates or parties that receive the most votes win. And what that means then is those who don't win the most votes don't win and don't get any representation. We sometimes call this winner take all, because the winner of the most votes takes the whole constituency. Now, this could be multiple candidates, could be multiple parties, but in all cases, the winners of the most votes take the whole constituency. A single member district plurality system is one in which individuals cast a single vote for a candidate in a single member district. The candidate with the most votes wins. So these include like the United Kingdom, India, Canada, Nigeria, Zambia. These are all examples of single member district plurality systems. So let's take a look at a single member district plurality system. These are election results from the Corby constituency in the UK, the legislative elections of 2010. And we have 4 candidates: Louise Bagshwa, Phil Hope, Portia Wilson, and Roy Davies. Bagshwa won 42.2% of the vote. Phil Hope won 38.6% of the vote. Portia Wilson won 14.5% of the vote. And Roy Davies won 3.6% of the vote. Now, using the chat, just let us know who won this election under the single member district plurality system. Take just a moment here, look at these results, and think about our concept of the single member district plurality system. Who won the election? Got the answers rolling in. Seeing a lot of consistency here. Good. Even if this seems obvious to you, go ahead and respond. Yes, Marissa, absolutely. So let's go back. A single member district plurality system is one in which individuals cast a single vote for a candidate in a single member district. The candidate with the most votes wins. Good, we're seeing a lot of consistency here. I am pleased that this is connecting for you. Now, if you said Louise Bagshwa, you are correct. If you said the Conservative Party, you are essentially correct, but what I would add is that remember that in a single member district plurality system, you vote for candidates. You don't vote for a party. And the reason this is an important distinction is because there are systems where you might vote for a party and then the party who wins the district gets to decide which party member will be that representative for that district. That's actually different than a single member district plurality system. It's a little bit different because in this case, we're voting for candidates who've already been identified. And so technically, to be as precise as possible, Bagshwa is the winner. You could say the Conservative Party won, but it's important to indicate that Bagshwa won because this is a race between candidates, not a race between parties. And so this is the advantage of this kind of approach where we respond to these simple questions. We can really clarify how the concept works. In this case, Bagshwa won. Yeah, sure, the Conservative Party did win, but technically it's Bagshwa who won because the candidate for that party was already identified before the election and voters voted for candidates, not parties. Remember, there are systems where you only vote for a party and the party then determines after the election who will be the representative if that party actually won. Now, here's where it begins to get more interesting. We know that single member district plurality systems are quite common. And we talked about that last week in connection with party systems. But alternative vote systems are a little bit different. And this has to do with what you've often maybe heard of referred to as ranked choice voting. Now, alternative vote is a system of what is essentially preferential voting that is used in single member districts. And so single member districts are still relevant here, but the difference is under alternative vote systems, you vote by ranking one or more candidates or parties in order of preference. and the candidate who gets an absolute majority is elected. But there's an important caveat. If no candidate wins an absolute majority, then the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and her votes are reallocated according to the next highest preference expressed on each ballot until one candidate has an absolute majority. So basically the way this works is when you get your ballot, there might be, 8 choices or eight open spaces. And then you list from 1 to 8 in order of preference the candidates that you want to see win. Number 1 is obviously the candidate that you like the most and that you want to win, the person I actually want. Number 2 is the person you would probably accept if they won. Number 3 is a person you will tolerate. Number 4, maybe you're not excited about them. You wouldn't piss on them if they were on fire. Maybe you wouldn't throw them under a moving bus, but you wouldn't necessarily vouch for them either. Number 5, you would piss on them if they were on fire. Number 6, you would punch them in the face if they stood on your doorstep. Number 7, I think that's, maybe that's Swedish, I don't know. But number 7 is obviously your least preferred candidate. And the idea is this ranked choice voting gives voters the power to identify from most to least preferred all the candidates that could potentially be in office. And you want to give them as much freedom to identify their choices as possible. And the idea is if a candidate wins an absolute majority in that first race, they win. But because there are so many candidates who might be listed, it's actually seldom the case that a candidate wins an absolute majority right off the bat. So if no candidate wins that majority, then what we do is we take away the candidates who received the fewest votes one by one, beginning with the candidate who received the fewest, and then their votes are reallocated according to the next highest preference expressed on individual ballots. And so it's basically a sort of accumulation of the preference order of all the different voters. And so let me show you the way this works by looking at some actual election results. So we're going to look at the alternative vote system results in the Richmond constituency in New South Wales in the election in 1990. These were legislative elections. Now, you take a look, and we notice that Gavin Bailey is the candidate who received the smallest share of the vote and the fewest votes. This candidate received 187 votes. Notice also, though, that no candidate won an absolute majority. The highest share was 41% received by Charles Blunt. And that's only a plurality. They need to win an absolute majority in order to take the seat in this first election. But because no one does, what we do is we strike Gavin Bailey and we reallocate the votes of Gavin Bailey according to the preference order on the ballots of individual voters. And so we redistribute those 187 votes. We strike Gavin Bailey. Now, the second count highlights the redistribution of the vote according to the preference order of all of the ballots. Now, we can't know sort of in total what all those different preference orders were, but what I'm showing you is the way in which the votes were reallocated according to that range of different preference orders of the different ballots of voters. And so we see this redistribution of the vote. And now what we have is a situation where we have to look and see, did anyone win an absolute majority? Well, no. In fact, it's even more difficult to identify a clear winner because we have even smaller shares of the vote. But what we do now is we go to the next candidate in line who received the fewest votes, and that is Dudley Leggett. Notice that in this second count, Dudley Leggett got only roughly less than 0.5% of the vote. Because of that, we redistribute those 294 votes received by Dudley Leggett, and we strike Dudley Leggett from the race. We've now striked Dudley Leggett from the race, and we've redistributed those votes according to the preference order on the ballots. Now we have a situation where we're beginning to get a little bit closer to a potential decision. Notice that Charles Blunt now has 41% of the vote. That's not an absolute majority, so we can't give Charles Blunt the seat just yet. But we now have a situation where we have a new candidate who received the smallest share, and that candidate is Ian Patterson. Ian Patterson received less than 1% of the vote, and the next lowest percentage was Alan Sims. But because we only strike one candidate at a time, we now redistribute the 530 votes of Ian Patterson by, again, referring to the preference order of all the different ballots. So we've now redistributed those votes. What we have now is a situation where we're getting closer to a majority, but we still don't have one. Yet again, Charles Blunt is in the lead and has a plurality, 41.2%, but he needs a majority to actually win. We look and we find that there are candidates who obviously received less than that. Alan Sims received 1.6%. 1.6% is the lowest share of the vote in this fourth count. What we're going to do then is we're going to redistribute the 1,116 votes of Sims across these other candidates. And so like we did before, we'd redistribute those votes. Now we have a situation where Charles Blunt has 42% of the vote, Caldecott has 24.1%, Neville Newell has 27.1%, and Stan Gibbs has 6.8%. Now, Charles Blunt still has a plurality, but Charles Blunt does not have an absolute majority. We have other candidates, and Stan Gibbs is the candidate who received the smallest share of the vote in this fifth count. That is, this fifth count, this reference to the preference order of all the different rankings on the ballots. That means then that we redistribute the 4,683 votes of Stan Gibbs from this fifth count. Now we have a situation where we have three candidates. This is the sixth count. Sorry, everyone. This is supposed to say Caldecott. My bad. Actually, let me change this real quick, because this is important. Sometimes these things happen. Okay. Now we have three candidates. Then there were three. We've got Neville Newell, who in this sixth count has 29.4% of the vote, Charles Blunt, 43.2%, and Helen Caldecott, 27.4%. Now, Caldecott is the candidate among these three who received the smallest share. So we're going to redistribute those 18,903 votes according to that preference order of all the ballots. Now we've got two candidates. We've redistributed the vote, and at last we have arrived at a candidate who's won an absolute majority according to the ranked voting on all the different ballots submitted. In this seventh count, we find that Neville Newell has surpassed that threshold for a majority with 50.5% of the vote. Charles Blunt received 49.5% of the vote. In this election, Charles Blunt was the incumbent. Neville Newell defeated Charles Blunt in this election and replaced Charles Blunt in this seat in the legislature in Richmond, New South Wales, in South Wales. This is the nature of a ranked choice system. Voters vote once, but they're given the opportunity to rank their preferences, and then the rankings themselves are then used to redistribute the vote according to the preference listing of all of the different ballots. In the end, the winner of an absolute majority, however many redistributions it takes, will be the candidate who wins that election. If in that first count, one candidate wins an absolute majority, there's no need to go to a second, a third, or a fourth, or a fifth, or a sixth, or a seventh count. But unless they receive that absolute majority, the counts go on until one is received. And so it can go all the way up to, in this case, a seventh count. But we can imagine a situation where voters might have 10 preferences that they can list from most to least preferred, or maybe 15. It just might depend on the precise system and how many slots are in the rank listing or the rank order that's made available to voters on the ballot. This is an alternative vote system. This is the nature of the system. Take a look at what this looks like in practice. Here's an Australian how to vote card from the 2004 legislative elections. This is a party basically saying, this is how you should order the candidates. This is your preference order. This is what we think you should do when you go to the ballot box. You should put Southwick David first, and then your second choice should be Jackal. Your third choice should be Cameron. Your fourth choice should be Beale. Your fifth choice should be Horan. Your sixth choice would be Lewis, and so on and so forth. These are very common in ranked choice systems. Parties try to influence the choices made by voters by setting out for them the rank preferences or the preference order for those races. And in this case, the Liberal Party, represented by David Southwick in this particular district, was calling on voters to vote for them in the name of a stronger economy and a stronger Australia. And this is pretty customary. This is the nature of a alternative vote system. And you can see plainly how different it is from a system like our own, where you cast a single vote for a single candidate and you cannot rank your preferences whatsoever. You're simply given a choice between, the major candidates from the major parties. Of course, you can write in a candidate, or you can vote for a third party or a libertarian candidate or something like that. But in all cases, in our system of majoritarian winner-take-all elections, you vote for a single candidate. In Fiji, alternative vote systems are also used. And in this case, you also list your preferences, and you can identify them in a variety of ways. But again, the key point is the same, which is that you rank them according to your most to least preferred candidates. And in the end, the actual winner of the election must receive an absolute majority, however many rounds of counting it takes to reach that absolute majority through the redistribution of the votes received by lesser candidates. Okay, so we're going to watch a video about ranked choice voting and how it may or may not change US elections if it were implemented. And this is an interesting conversation for us to have because it brings into focus questions about the integrity of the system, the representativeness of the system, choice. It makes us think about how well the system works. It makes us think about the possible options that are available to us if we decide to reform the system. And I want you to focus in particular on how some states give voters the option of ranking their choices while others don't. And we want to think about how this kind of voting system might change US elections just sort of more generally. And so we'll watch this video. It's about, it's a few minutes long, and then we'll get back together and we'll have a discussion about whether ranked choice voting would change US elections.
Washington is totally broken.
Washington is broken.
Washington right now is broken.
Nothing will get done in Washington this year because Washington is broken.
For years now, politicians have been telling the American public that they can't deliver their campaign promises because of the gridlock in Washington. But with so much at stake, from healthcare to education to Social Security, it seems there is more than just ideological differences standing in the way of social progress. At times, it seems like the whole system is set up to fail. But two researchers are claiming that the industry that spent $6.5 billion in 2016 and $5.73 billion in 2018 is flourishing.
The parties, the political industrial complex, which works very well together in one particular way, and that is to rig the rules of the game, to protect themselves jointly from new competition. Politics isn't broken, it's fixed.
A movement has been growing across the country to change how the system works. Places like Maine, San Francisco, and Santa Fe are changing the way their representatives are chosen to allow voters to rank their preferences instead of choosing only one representative. Initial surveys of ranked choice voting in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Cambridge show voters are more satisfied with the conduct of local campaigns than in similar cities with plurality, winner takes all, voting. Could ranked choice voting save Washington? In 2002, the late Senator John McCain campaigned to support instant runoff voting, also known as ranked choice voting.
Hello, this is Senator John McCain. I'm calling to urge your support for Ballot Measure 1 on August 27th. Ballot Measure 1 will adopt a fairer voting method. It will lead to good government because Alaska will elect leaders who have the support of a majority of voters.
And that same year, then Senator Barack Obama introduced SB 1789 that would have created instant runoff voting for Congress and state primaries, as well as authorized it for local elections. Ranked choice voting is an alternative way for citizens to vote for who they would like to represent them in office.
You pick your favorite, just like always. But then if you want, you can also say, this is my second choice, my third choice, my fourth choice, and my last, my least favorite choice. The polls close, and now all the first place votes are counted. And if that candidate has a true majority, meaning over 50%, well, the election's over and that candidate wins. But if after the first place votes are counted, none of the 5 has over 50%, then the candidate that is in last place is automatically eliminated from the race, and voters who had selected that candidate first now have their second place votes counted instead. We rerun the totals, and you continue on that process until the election produces a true majority winner, meaning we're always going to elect the candidate with the broadest appeal to the most number of voters.
You could vote for me as your number 1, knowing that you could vote for Hillary Clinton or whoever your safety is as your number 2.
Researchers Catherine Gale and Michael Porter claim Democratic and Republican candidates have no incentive to work towards societal greater good because they're beholden to the party more than their constituents. Instead, they argue, the parties are operating in a duopoly, prohibiting independent candidates from achieving success, creating a formula that rotates different figureheads and limits opportunities for innovation.
A duopoly is an industry where there are 2 dominant competitors. And in the politics industry, we of course have the Democrats and the Republicans as our 2 dominant rivals.
Think of Coke and Pepsi as mentioned in a recent Freakonomics podcast episode. It's in their best interest for Dr. Pepper never to gain the notoriety of the other 2 soda brands.
The Democrats and Republicans, they are a combined duopoly. I mean, they dominate this space. There's a reason why people like Mike Bloomberg, Howard Schultz, whoever else you can name that's considered running as an independent has not run. Well, you call it unfair, but that's just the way our political system, that's what it's turned into now.
You're looking for a perfect process. That's not what democracy is. And if you're looking for everyone to come out a winner, that's also not what democracy is. It's not Junior League T-ball where everybody gets a prize. There are winners and losers. And how you vote shapes who wins and who loses.
In today's climate, there's incentives for people to be partisan. And every single move is being tracked. Every word they say from the time, even before they announce a president, is being tracked, recorded, monitored. It's impossible to try and subtly change your way halfway through a campaign. You're going to get called out on it.
And many of these call-outs are done by members of the candidate's own parties.
The vice president has still failed to acknowledge that it was wrong to take the position that he took at that time.
If you want to do well running for office in a ranked choice voting election, and you want supporters of other candidates to rank you as their second choice, then there's an incentive to be a little nicer to those candidates and maybe not attack them.
The idea that somehow elections are going to get less rancorous, that's just not going to happen. We are in a state in this country where people have fundamental disagreements about very important issues. That's not going to change just because you change the way candidates are chosen in the voting process.
Ranked choice voting is compelling for a number of reasons. I think in today's politics, its most compelling is to just allow us to have more than two choices, to allow new players to sort of enter the marketplace of ideas and to be considered and evaluated and voted upon for what they're saying and what they're offering, rather than the sort of the horse race partisan impact of what they might mean for splitting votes and so on.
The third-party candidate ultimately just siphons off votes. A third-party candidate ultimately undermines the nominee of a particular party. And in this case, if it's the Green Party running a third-party candidacy, it will have the same impact that it did in 2016, or when Al Gore ran and Ralph Nader was the spoiler in that race. A third-party candidacy is a spoiler.
I want to see an alternative political party. These two political parties are telling millions of Americans they have nowhere to go. And people don't like choices like Tweedledum, Tweedledee.
If you have more choices and more opportunity for new players to get in the arena, that can ultimately create better products for consumers. And I think that's the same basic dynamic in politics.
Gale and Porter argue that candidates and elected officials may be able to get bipartisan laws passed, but there's no reward for not supporting the party, because if you vote against the party line, you won't receive their support in the next election. Ranked choice voting would change that, because voters can be more or less supportive of elected officials based on their actions, not just their policies and positions.
If you solve anything in a bipartisan way, you likely won't make it back through your primary.
Not a lot of crap. You know, I hear that argument from so many Democrats and Republicans that they say they're getting burned at home because they're working across the aisle. They're not working across the aisle, they're posturing. Right? I've never seen a politician lose an election because they built a bipartisan coalition and accomplished something. I think they do lose credibility when they show themselves to be hypocrites.
And in a political climate where there's no reward for coming in second, the party's support can make or break a candidate.
Imagine a market where you as an emerging business could only make your first dollar when you were the biggest company in that market, right? So that you can't grow. Like if you start off at 10%, you're making nothing. 20%, you're still making nothing. 30%, you're making nothing. Finally get up to 40% or whatever it is, and you can actually make all the money, right? Or something like that, right? But it's like really hard. So the market is very duopolistic that way.
When you look behind the scenes, we find that Democrats and Republicans work very well together in one particular way, and that is to cooperate, some would say collude, to set rules and practices that protect the industry from themselves, that protect themselves jointly from new competition.
That's one of the reasons Maine chose to adopt ranked choice voting.
Then you have the state of Maine, which is for us a thrilling story. It's a state that has advanced ranked choice voting first at the local level. Then they have moved in, they used it for congressional elections and all their primaries in 2018, and now they've adopted it for president.
Maine, as you know, last year, so the 2018 election, had the first federal election ever, a congressional race, using the ranked choice voting system. That race shows why ranked choice voting is not a good idea. The candidate who got the largest number of votes, the largest plurality in the first round of tabulations, did not actually win the race. And because there were multiple rounds of tabulation, apparently thousands of ballots cast by voters were thrown out.
However, supporters of the process claim it gives more power to the voters by making votes for third-party candidates count when the tally moves to an instant runoff. Think of the duopoly example of Coke and Pepsi. Just because a voter prefers Dr. Pepper, it doesn't mean that he or she doesn't want soda at all. This change in the process challenges the duopoly of the two parties and reforms the industry. Opponents argue that this requires too much of the voter.
You talk to the average voter about this, and I think the average voter has the same feelings that former California Governor Jerry Brown has. They find ranked choice voting to be confusing and overcomplicated.
Virtually without exception. It's been a very positive, supportive reaction from voters saying, I liked this better than what I did before. The very strongest support is from people under 40 who are not sort of used to a single choice ballot. They're like, of course this is better to be able to rank rather than vote for one.
According to an exit poll conducted by the Bangor Daily News in Maine, over 74% of people said ranking choices was either somewhat easy or very easy. In the US, it's been used in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Santa Fe, with 5 new cities using it in November 2019.
And then the fact that you can't get elected for president next year without winning or competing for electoral votes in Maine, and you won't be elected for president without learning something about ranked choice voting because you have to win in Maine.
Other countries, like Australia and Ireland, use a version of ranked choice voting. And while some claim the process favors progressive ideals, the Conservative Prime Minister Scott Morrison won re-election in Australia.
All of these rules, practices, and norms have been created outside of the Constitution, and therefore the good news is that as dysfunctional as so much of this politics industry is, it's invented, and we, the citizens, can force changes in that invention.
So this is a really interesting video because it puts this in the US context. And of course, we just had an election, so this is very fresh. And the question of whether ranked choice voting would change US elections, this is a very important question right now. And this is actually a question that Jake raised last week when we talked about party systems. And Jake's question was, would ranked choice voting lead to more parties, or would it change elections more generally? This is a question I want to put to you. After our discussion and after watching this video, do you think that ranked choice voting would change US elections, and how so? Kevin says that it would be a bit smoother. Do you want to elaborate a little bit, Kevin? That's an interesting idea. Oh, and that's a good point too. Kevin points out that the runoff in Georgia for the Senate races there would have already been known because ranked choice voting, the alternative vote system as we also call it, it involves an instant runoff. And so because we're ranking candidates, we sort of already have those runoff elections sort of already on the ballot, so to speak. And so that would resolve that pending question and would eliminate the need for that second runoff election. That is also relevant because that would mean that it would reduce election fatigue. One complaint and one reason for low voter turnout in the US is that we have too many elections. Ranked choice voting would be a series of instant runoffs where voters would essentially vote multiple times, so to speak, at one time. And that would then resolve some of those pending questions about who might be the winner. But how else would ranked choice voting change US elections? Stephen says, I feel that it could, because then we wouldn't just be seeing the two main parties that we have in this country deadlocking the government. I think it would allow for more voices and parties in government to actually try to get things done for the betterment of this country. Yeah, Stephen. So one possibility, as we saw in the video, is that even if in that first round, a traditional, dominant party candidate wins a plurality, it's possible that in second and third rounds, a third party candidate who was very successful in getting broad support could defeat that candidate who won a plurality in the first round if that third party candidate eventually reached a majority through those subsequent rounds. That could improve representation. It could expand the number of parties in the system. It could strengthen third parties like the Green Party, and it could weaken some of these traditional parties that have benefited so tremendously from the winner-take-all system. And so I think that that's definitely a possibility. Efren says, I believe more underrepresented parties could see a slight rise due to favorability. However, we could see a slight decrease in the two-party system because it could be generalized that individuals desire new voices and representation. Yeah, without a doubt. I think that's one of the key advantages. And Jake adds, I think at the very least, voter turnout would increase because I don't think as many people would feel like their vote is meaningless. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the choices that ranked choice voting gives to voters. It permits them to express support for a wider range of candidates. And whether that requires them to know more about the individual candidates, that's sort of an important question. But without a doubt, as Jake points out, people can feel like their vote might be more meaningful because they don't necessarily fear ranking a third-party candidate high up on their preference order. And so, you know, candidates like Jill Stein of the Green Party, or, you know, some of these Ralph Nader, some of these other third-party candidates who've been somewhat successful, it's possible that under ranked choice voting, they would be even more successful because voters would be able to express their support for them by placing them either first or second or third in their preference order. Stephen says, is this why Maine and Nebraska split their electoral votes to try and give their citizens more of a voice? No, it's not. Nebraska splits their electoral votes. There's some specific reason related to legislation that was championed by a state legislator there. That's a decision that could be made by states. And the factors that lead to splitting electoral votes or dividing electoral votes by district can range from, you know, from anything to anything, but it doesn't have to do with ranked choice voting. And I know that because I'm from Nebraska, and in Nebraska, we don't have ranked choice voting. We have, you know, winner take all plurality systems, single member district plurality systems where we vote for a single candidate. It's just that on the state level, the actual electoral votes are divided by district. But in Maine, yeah, they do have ranked choice voting, but I don't think that that's why Maine splits their electoral votes by district. I think that has more to do with, you know, whatever decision they made as a state at some point to do that. Anna Martha says ranked choice is good because reduced negative campaigning. Yeah, because suddenly candidates have an incentive to try to appeal to the widest possible constituency, and at the very least to not be hostile to other candidates who might enjoy the support of a constituency who they also want to get the support of, at least somewhere in their list of preferences. You think about, for instance, you know, how would Donald Trump have campaigned if, or excuse me, let me actually go back. I don't mean that. We're not talking about presidential elections. We're talking about legislative elections. But how would, say, a firebrand legislator or incumbent or would-be politician, how would they campaign if they knew that they need to get broad support from a variety of different constituencies, since the voters in those constituencies can rank their preferences? Well, that candidate might campaign in a way that is more palatable and nicer to those other constituencies. They might be more unifying in their message. It might influence their agenda or the kinds of policy proposals that they advocate in their campaign. Jake says, I also don't buy the idea that it's too hard or too confusing for voters. Touche. They're already voting, right? You know, we're working on the assumption that they understand these policy proposals or these ballot measures or the candidates and their preferences. I mean, think about it. Even when you go and vote for the president, you have a choice between like 8 candidates, and you can even write something in. And so the idea that voters don't at least have some sense of who those different candidates are, it seems like sort of a flaccid idea. It's obvious from the video that those Democratic establishment figures interviewed, they clearly have some skin in the game, so to speak. Stephen says, I also feel that it would be a slow transition from the two-party system because the Democrats and the Republicans have run this country for decades, and we are stuck. Even with ranked choice voting, I feel that it could be a while before a third-party candidate breaks major ground. Touche, Stephen. And, you know, change doesn't happen overnight. And those two parties have a real chokehold on the US electorate. I think that it would take time, and it would take voters becoming more familiar with the system as well. But assuming that voter education can be prioritized and assuming that voters can make their choices, I think that it could lead to some change in the system. It could lead to a thaw of that two-party system. Okay, everybody, we are out of time. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to send an email about my office hours. I sent one yesterday, or I made an announcement yesterday that I would have them on Wednesday. Wednesday is Veterans Day, so there's no class or office hours on Wednesday. I will hold them on Thursday, though, and I'll make an announcement about that. But thank you very much for being here. I hope that you continue to stay engaged in the electoral process. We'll continue talking about electoral systems on Thursday, and we'll have some fun with it again. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.